Where basically the Cold War Republicans defeated Romney.
Did you talk to the entrance yet?
So which one?
Yeah, we have it saved on the desktop. We're just.
I can pull another one out.
It might be a good idea.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
We're on a hot mic right now.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a I don't really know why this.
Nathan? I just think that Nathan and Robin are the chairs.
Hey, Michael. Second try this.
Yeah, maybe we'll do 2 chairs here, or yeah, one on the side.
8:30 in the morning, I was out already.
I'll sit. This chair, and then.
Probably a good size.
So he's, I had, you know, I had to regret it.
So they were all in California, and then for civil
Don't worry. We're getting it.
10 years they were there.
Medium and all this. Makes zero difference.
Where's the
I don't think we'll do that.
chair?
You can have a stick that direction. If you practice, releasing Palestinians, and now you're babies or it's Iraq. So yeah, this one you got like.
Real nice, by the way.
You know, like a special spine, it looks just. See how there's a special handle where you've got a little thumb rest to it. Look at it. It's got like. They broadcasted it, so there's like. Awesome. They took him back. Back on the spine with his name on it. Oh, like She's got to get back on. Oh, he had this one where, I'm not sure if it was in this lecture, but it was much bigger. I gave her a new conference, incredibly boring. This guy was like, yeah, it's like, I gotta get out of here. Get a little more info. So finally, after, sat through what he could. Also, which, let's see, so he stayed in there the rest of the lecture. Until like everybody was going lights out, and then he like came up. Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. It's easy to forget those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, no big deal. But thank you. Oh, he was in there a long time. I got another one I'll tell you later too. It's even better. We laughed so hard. Even Mary was pretty flat down. It was just like both of us were like grabbing the neck. You know, it was like, wait, what's the
Good afternoon, everyone. It's 12 o'clock. Let's get started. On behalf of Adrian College's George Romney Institute for Law and Public Policy, welcome to today's debate titled, "Is Israel Guilty of Genocide in Gaza?" Before we begin, I'd like to thank President Docking and the entire Adrian College senior staff for supporting the Romney Institute and its programming, particularly today's debate. Next to me are two accomplished intellectuals and political authors who've written on today's topic. However, despite their shared interest and exceptional abilities, they've arrived at different conclusions on this important issue. David Gespass is a human rights attorney and past president of the National Lawyers Guild. He's also been a political activist on the front lines of many political controversies. Since 1978, he's represented the poor and those targeted by powerful institutions and governments in state and federal courts. He'll be arguing that Israel is guilty of genocide and has written an article published not long ago to that effect in National Lawyers Guild Review. Arguing the opposite is Robert Trzynski. Mr. Trzynski is the editor of the Trzynski Letter. He's the host of the Symposium podcast and a contributing writer for Discourse Magazine. He's written prolifically on politics for decades. His articles are distinguished by their eloquent prose, compelling reasoning, and mastery of the subject matter. His writings on Israel, and especially the attacks of October 7th, are especially insightful. I encourage all of you to read them, as with Mr. Gespass's article, arguing the opposite. Please join me in thanking our distinguished guests. The format for today's debate will be as follows. Mr. Gespass will argue for 10 minutes, followed by Mr. Trzynski. Then Mr. Gespass will respond for 5 minutes, followed by Mr. Trzynski. The remainder of the event will consist of questions for either speaker or both from the audience. I hope you will challenge these debaters with thoughtful questions that compel a stronger defense of their views. I have no doubt they can handle it. We'll conclude today's event at 12:50 p.m. so students can get to their 1 o'clock class on time. Mr. Gespass, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nathan, for that. What Nathan didn't mention about me, probably because I never told him, is that I spent 5 years in Hebrew school. I have been bar mitzvahed. I have sent money to Israel, to the Jewish National Fund. And quite frankly, it's my pride and my Jewish heritage that leads me to take the position I take today. And people kind of throw the term genocide around like fascist, things like that mean different things to different people in regular speak. But in terms of international law, there is a careful definition of genocide. And if I that is found in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, that notes, first of all, that genocide is illegal regardless of whether it's in war or peace, regardless of whether it's used for self-defense or otherwise. And it specifies that under the crime, it's committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group by killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mentally harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, the truth is, no one can really debate that A through D have all been committed by Israel. I'll get to that, I'll discuss that a bit, but the real question is whether it was done with the necessary specific intent. The International Court of Justice, the World Court, found relatively early on that the military operation resulted in tens of thousands of deaths and injuries and the destruction of homes, schools, medical facilities, and other vital infrastructure, as well as displacement on a massive scale. Probably more than 1 million Gazans have been forced to leave their homes and go once or more than once to other places. It also found the prolonged and widespread deprivation of food and other basic necessities. More than 40,000 people of a population of 2.1 million have been killed, substantial enough to meet the first criterion. And in fact, that's probably an underestimate. A peer-reviewed article in The Lancet determined the figure is at least 64,000 as of June 30th. Add to that the uncounted number of lost limbs and the psychological damage of seeing one's home destroyed, being forced to relocate. Note that ethnic cleansing, though not itself genocide, can be evidence of genocide. The relocation has often taken place multiple times. Serious bodily and mentally harm is inevitable just from those facts. Conditions imposed and found by the ICJ, lack of adequate or any water and food, unsanitary conditions, cramping of tens of thousands into less and less space are calculated to bring more death and misery. And the destruction of virtually every hospital in Gaza, and along with the displacement, while that certainly affects everyone, specifically for pregnant women, they lose their health care. In fact, it's been estimated some 15% increase in miscarriages since the beginning of the assault on Gaza. One nurse, in fact, had to choose and leave 4 premature children behind because she had to evacuate the hospital, taking only one in hopes that that one was strong enough to survive. UN Secretary General Guterres said the conditions would exponentially increase what was already a humanitarian nightmare. That is language from a diplomat who usually uses measured language. He found the healthcare system collapsing and nowhere in Gaza to be safe. What is at issue again is not whether Israel's actions meet the objective criteria for genocide, but whether Israel's subjective intent was to impose those conditions for the purpose of destroying in whole or in part the Palestinian population. And that's subject to demonstration in the usual ways, either by direct evidence, which there's plenty of, or by circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence, let's begin not with October 7th, 2023, but back in 1946, with the establishment of the State of Israel by Zionist gangs like the Irgun and Stern Gang, who began a systematic campaign of terror, either to kill Palestinians or force them from their homes and en masse from their villages. It was this violence, not the simple arrival of Jews in the historic Palestine, that defined what Palestinians referred to as the Nakba. And it's continued off and on ever since. There have been at least 5, prior to the last one, at least 5 invasions of Gaza by Israel between 2008 and 2022. And former Zionist terrorists became Israel's political leaders. And with Netanyahu, Israeli politics have become increasingly reactionary and chauvinist. The borders of Israel have expanded dramatically over the decades at the expense of Palestinians. Netanyahu now refers to all of historic Palestine as Judea and Samaria, the names for lands today's Zionists claim for themselves alone. West Bank settlers, their settlements internationally acknowledged as illegal, routinely kill Palestinians, destroy their crops and homes with impunity, while the Israeli army arrests Palestinians for defending their rights or merely refusing to leave their homes voluntarily. This has increased markedly since the invasion of Gaza. Israeli Defense Minister Golan, here's for some direct evidence. Defense Minister Golan said, and these are just samples, "We are imposing complete siege on Gaza. There will be no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything will be closed. We are fighting against human animals, and we are acting accordingly. Dehumanization of the group is a favorite tactic of genocidaires." President Herzog said, "An entire nation out there is responsible." Netanyahu referred to Palestinians as Amalek, which is a biblical reference to a group that God allegedly told Saul to eradicate and destroy, and he called them monsters. Knesset member Gottlieb said, "Bomb without distinction, flatten Gaza." And in fact, a group of leading Israelis stated specifically that the extensive and blatant incitement to genocide, expulsion, and ethnic cleansing in Gaza by public figures. Israeli soldiers have gotten that message. On social media, they've called Palestinians terrorists, roaches, and rats. They posted pictures of themselves committing heinous acts against defenseless Palestinians with no fear of reprisal in Israel. They've attacked and bombed the ever-shifting safe zones, the place Israel say you can go and you'll be okay, as well as the roads that Israel told them to take to those safe zones. There's been reports of torture and rape. In fact, the very scale of the devastation can be and is evidence of intent. Some 70% of the deaths have been women and children. At a time when it's estimated that only 5,000 men had been killed, Israel boasted of killing 7,000 what they called terrorists. Not people, not human beings, but terrorists. The destruction of hospitals has led, among other things, to women who are pregnant not being able to give birth safely. There's been a 15% increase of miscarriages in Israel since then. And that's not simply my opinion. The UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestinian territories issued a report entitled Anatomy of a Genocide. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, along with Hamas leader Mohammed Deif, so it can't be accused of favoring one side. The ICJ has found sufficient evidence for South Africa's suit alleging genocide to proceed, and in fact ordered Israel to take immediate provisional measures to prevent human rights abuses, finding by overwhelming votes the risk of irreparable prejudice to Palestinians' rights. Israel has failed to comply in a meaningful way. Never again means something to me as with my Jewish heritage. It means never again, not just to Jews, never again to anyone. That's why I take the stand I take today. Thank you.
Mr. Trzynski has 10 minutes to respond.
That's a tribute. Take your time.
All right, So, it's nice that it's up here, because I wanted to refer to the definition he gave here of genocide, which is killing members of the group, causing serious bodily and mentally harm, inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, or conditions of life that are incompatible with survival, that are intolerable. Here's the problem. That's the definition of war, right? There is no war in which all three of those conditions have not been met. You know, there's a reason we say war is hell. All wars create those kind of casualties. So when you can go online, you can find lots of photos of Gaza after this war, and you see that the rubble in the streets and the displaced people and the misery of the conditions. But the thing is, I could show you exactly the same kind of photos from Berlin in 1945, and I think that's a useful comparison because I sometimes find it useful to think about the headlines you see right now and write them as if they were written about Germany in World War II. So there's a real headline: UN officials describe catastrophic conditions in Gaza as Israel advances. Well, what do you think instead of officials describe catastrophic conditions in Berlin as Allies advance? And the conditions were, in both cases, were catastrophic. People don't remember the wide-scale devastation we had to inflict to defeat the Nazis. I looked this up just before World War II. Berlin was a city of 4.5 million people after decades of rapid growth. After the war, it was less than 3 million people. And it still is not back up to 4 million, 80 years later, still not back up to 4 million people. So, the equivalent of the entire population of Gaza was killed or displaced from Berlin by World War II. But then the question becomes, well, should we not have fought that war? Should we have left the Nazis in power? Would the world have been better or much worse? Now, obviously, it would be worse, and that's kind of a lesson in this case. Why would Israel, and for many people this applies only to Israel, why would Israel be expected not to take steps to defend their country from a brutal attack? And that's kind of, there's a double standard here, because I heard a lot about what Israel has done. And the word I didn't hear in David's presentation was Hamas, right? That the Palestinian Gaza specifically has a group, a leadership that has been in power there for about 18, 20 years, and that we focus on Israel's actions and we hold it to a high, and I think even possibly to an excessively high standard, but we don't focus on the actions of Hamas, and we don't hold them to any standards at all. And we kind of start in midstream, talking about everything that's happened after October 8th, starting on October 8th, but not talking about, why is this war exist in the first place? Well, it exists because of the October 7th attacks. And the point I want to make is the October 7th attack on Israel was clearly genocidal in intent. And you can see that by looking at the Hamas charter, where they have this, in the Hamas charter, they have this idea that the area of Israel, from the river to the sea is the phrase they use. That means from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. It means all of Israel. It should be solely the exclusive domain of Arab Muslims. And they have that very specifically spelled out in the Hamas charter. And you can also see that, so that implies at the very least ethnic cleansing of Israel, eliminating all the Jews. And since the Jews aren't going to cooperate with their own ethnic cleansing, it implies a goal of genocide. And you can also see that intent is carried out or reflected in the October 7th attacks. The October 7th attacks did not go after military or strategic sites. They were primarily indiscriminate slaughter, men, women, children, most notoriously young people at a music event in the desert. And not only did they do that, but they also, Hamas leaders promised a second, a third, a fourth such attack in the future. So Israel's actions have been taken in response to that genocidal intent of Hamas. So in addition, I also want to point the deaths of their own people were also a part of the Hamas goal, and they're pretty open about this. So mass death of Palestinians was part of the Hamas war plan. So you have Hamas leaders going on TV and Arab TV television shows and saying things like, the thing any Palestinian desires the most is to be martyred for the sake of Allah, which is a really easy thing to say from a TV studio in Qatar. And another Hamas leader goes on talking about how Russia sacrificed 30 million people in World War II fighting against Germany, 30 million of their own civilians. And he talks a whole list of other conflicts and the millions who have died to liberate this country or that country, and says we're going to do the same in Gaza. So again, the rhetoric is reflected in the action. Hamas put in millions of dollars, vast resources to build tunnels for its fighters to protect them. No effort was put in to create civilian bomb shelters, or to stockpile supplies, or to provide protected areas for medical care. Now you're planning to start a war, you know there's going to be retaliation from the other side, and you take no effort to spare this, to protect against civilian deaths on your own side. Civilian deaths are part of the plan because that's how Hamas has always gotten bailed out. I regret to say even this event, in a way, is effectively part of the Hamas war plan in a perverse way, because they launch an attack, the Israeli response inevitably results in civilian deaths, and then we have events thousands of miles away here where we sit down and ask, well, have the Israelis gone too far? And then the pressure is put on Israel to stop the attack against Hamas. That is part of the Hamas war plan. Now, and in fact, we also know what Israel's preferred solution was in Gaza, because we know what Israel was actually doing before October 7th. Now, you say there have been raids and attacks and attacks in Gaza, but up to October 7th, there was a policy of allowing Palestinians to leave Gaza to work in neighboring Israeli settlements. And the general Israeli policy was to encourage Gazans to focus on pursuing prosperity instead of conflict. And again, you see the Hamas leaders, one of them goes on TV, boasting about how they lulled Israel into complacency by making them think that we wanted prosperity, when instead what we really wanted the whole time was martyrdom. And this is something, there's a lot of whitewashing in the West about the fanaticism of the Hamas ideology. These are religious zealots who worship violence and death. And David mentioned various radical parts of the Israeli political scene, but those are parts, those are factions within Israeli politics. Hamas was the ruling party with no dissent, because they don't allow dissent in Gaza. So officially Israel has to do something in response to the October 7th attacks. The only question is, what should they do? And I'm concerned the objections raised here to war in Gaza would apply to any other war. You remember what I said about Germany in World War II, where the destruction was a much bigger scale than in Gaza, but the paradox is that an accusation of genocide would in effect prevent a defense against genocide. Now, to put this in perspective, I want to give some actual numbers, because I say this is capped in any war. So one worthwhile measure I've seen is about how an army carries out its wars is the ratio of civilians killed to enemy soldiers killed. And every war results in civilian deaths. But a war conducted with genocidal intent will tend to see a very high death ratio of civilians to soldiers, since the goal is basically to kill everyone. So let's take a look from a different war, one that's going on right now. Let's take a look at figures. I looked up some figures for the siege of Mariupol in Ukraine in 2022. So we're just entered the 4th year of the war in Ukraine. This is the first year of the war. There was a siege of a city, similar kind of conditions to Gaza. The Russians laying siege to the Ukrainian city of Mariupol. And I looked it up here. The Russians killed about 900 Ukrainian soldiers. And depending on the estimates, somewhere between 30,000 civilians and 90,000 civilians in Mariupol. So that's between, depending on the estimates, 30 to 100 civilians for every 1 military casualty. Now in Gaza, the IDF claims a ratio, a 1-to-1 civilian to combatant ratio. They say, 20,000 Hamas dead and about 40,000 dead total. Other estimates obviously are less generous, less friendly to Israel. They're higher, but they still give ratios of somewhere like 2-to-1 to 4-to-1. Now this is a tragedy. Like I said, there's a reason why we say war is hell. This is a tragedy. People are dying. People are being harmed. There's a great civilian cost. Yep. But it's nowhere near the minimum 30-to-1 the Russians inflicted in Mariupol. Now, that this implies to me is that casualties in Gaza are within the range of normal destruction in war. And in war, death is never just for the soldier. Death and suffering comes to all. If we want to prevent this, we have to look looking at how to prevent war. But that can't be done while Hamas is in power and pursuing, like I said, this fanatical, literally death-worshipping agenda. So that's the last big problem with these accusations of genocide against Israel, and it provides no answer to what should Israel do. And for a lot of the critics, the answer seems to be they should do nothing. Now, I'm open to criticism of current Israeli policy. I think they've tried all sorts of different things in dealing with the Palestinian population, and they don't really seem to know quite what they're going to do or what they want to do or how it's all going to end. They have a lot of dilemmas they're facing. But I also get the sense that no policy they try, will meet with the approval of many of their critics. Yeah. So I just want to sort of challenge anybody criticizing Israel has to provide an actual realistic idea for how the country can provide for security against neighbors, who themselves have genocidal intent.
Thank you. Mr. Gaspar has 5 minutes to respond.
I was asked to talk about whether Israel committed genocide in Gaza, not about Ukraine, not about World War II. I don't defend genocide anywhere, but we are talking specifically here. Frank, I have been to Ukraine. I observed an election there. My wife has observed 3 there. We have friends in Ukraine. Yes, Russia's committing genocide in Ukraine. That doesn't excuse Israel. Yes, the bombing of Dresden was terrible. That doesn't excuse Israel. Yes, the Hamas attack in Israel was a violation of international law. That doesn't excuse Israel. On the contrary, the response was exactly what Hamas wanted. Over 50% of the Gazan population was under 18. And what were those kids taught by Israel's response? That the only way to get their rights is through violence, through terror, not by any other way. So what Israel has done is create a new generation of fighters against them. But when it could have tried something else, and we allow Palestinians to come work, but there are checkpoints and people have died waiting to get to hospitals at those checkpoints because it takes hours to get through them, whereas Israeli settlers just go right through whenever they want to. It is, if that was Hamas's plan, then why did Israel do everything in its power to comply with Hamas's wishes? Is that intelligent? Is that rational? Is that reasonable? No. And Netanyahu, the longest serving prime minister in Israel, has made it clear by his actions and by his words that he has no interest in a Palestinian state, that he has no interest in a state in which Palestinians live in Israel with equal rights. He has no interest in any of that. He wants a Jewish regime throughout what he calls Samaria. He wants a Jewish regime throughout with no Palestinian rights. And everything Israel has done, not just since October 7th, but before, has led to that outcome. And it doesn't matter whether war is held elsewhere, because genocide is unlawful even in times of war. It doesn't matter whether others have committed genocide. It doesn't even matter whether Hamas did, because that's not the issue today. And remember, the ICC indicted, sent out arrest warrants for Hamas leadership too. There is, I think, unfortunately, Rob uses, whataboutism is not really an excuse or a rationalization or an explanation for genocide. We can say, what about the destruction of native people in this country, in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand? Yeah, that was genocide. Does that mean that we should excuse it when colonial settlers are doing the same thing in historic Palestine? Or do we learn from history? Do we take those things and, rather than deny them, accept them and say we have to change?
1 minute.
I'm done. Thank you.
Cynthia has 5 minutes to respond.
So I think it's interesting that interpreting this whataboutism. So my intention was not to say, other people committed genocide, so therefore it's okay. My intention is to say, you have the challenge of, and the challenge I left you with, which is what else would it be possible for Israel to do? And so you cannot simply take the conditions of war as such and describe that as genocide, because then you have the idea that if you create that standard, then basically nobody can defend themselves in a war, right? Because if you're attacked and you fight back and you create conditions that are intolerable and you kill lots of people on the other side, that's therefore genocide. It applies, like I said, it creates this paradox where it becomes genocide to defend yourself against genocide. And that's why I brought up the example of World War II. So the point is that you have to have some answer to how can Israel defend itself? What is the alternative plan? They could do something else. Well, what something else is there? And the interesting thing I find about Israel's policy is it has actually tried just about everything. They tried occupying Gaza. They tried occupying the Palestinian territories and using a more conventional counterinsurgency plan where you occupy and you patrol and you pacify the population. And they did that for decades, and it didn't, they were condemned for doing that. They tried about 25 years ago, they had a big policy was disengagement. They said, okay, we're going to disengage. We're going to wall off, put a wall between ourselves and these Palestinian areas, and we're going to, instead of coming in and patrolling and trying to pacify it, we're going to disengage. We're going to, leave them separate in their own area. And again, the Hamas sent rockets over, and they had to come back in and retaliatory attacks. That did not work. So there's been a whole series of things that Israel has attempted to do. And this is Israel is war in general, and specifically the kind of war that Israel is fighting is a complex thing that has lots of difficulties and trade-offs and no good solutions to it. And what they're specifically fighting there is a what's called a counterinsurgency war, right? This is where you are trying to assert control over a certain territory, and the population there is hostile to you, and you have insurgents, unconventional war, using unconventional war, terrorism, rocket attacks, guerrilla warfare to try to resist that control. And they have the support of the local population. So it's a very specific kind of war, and there are different ways of dealing with that. Israel has tried many of these different ways. It's been condemned at each point for trying each of them. So the question here is, I think that that they're floundering a little bit right now in terms of they don't know what approach they can take. But the point is that you can't go to a people in the position of Israel where the situation, so for example, I mentioned Hamas having genocidal intent, and even though they don't have the power to commit a genocide against the whole of Israeli people, they did manage on October 7th to inflict the largest number of targeted deaths of Jews since the Holocaust. So you can't, I think somebody did a calculation that, if you took the ratio of populations, the number of deaths in the United States from an attack like that would be in the tens of thousands of people in terms of people murdered, kidnapped, civilians' deaths. And you can imagine how we would respond. We would demand that our government had to do something. Any government would, any people would demand that they be defended against an unprovoked attack, of indiscriminate attack on women and children. And the basic security of the people, their right to live, is under attack if they're not allowed to respond and take military action to defend themselves. And so I think a overly broad definition of genocide that would encompass any act of war almost is basically, like I said, the paradox it creates is that in being against genocide, it makes it impossible to defend against genocide.
Thank you. The rest of today's event will be dedicated to questions from the audience. You're welcome to ask a question of either speaker or both. And I know that both of these speakers invite any question that you may have. It's important to them that you feel free to raise any issue, no matter how controversial. As I mentioned in my introduction, they can handle it. So please, the floor is open to questions. Yeah, yes, please.
David was right that the topic for today was, did Israel commit genocide in Gaza? Unfortunately, you were wrong about everything else. First, let's start with the history. I mean, you put everything within the context of the Middle East, not Gaza. This was genocide in Gaza. You were talking about how in 46, several terrorist organizations started. It wasn't in 46, it was in 48. And it wasn't terrorists, were the survivors of the Holocaust that came to Israel and started the country. Now, between 48 and 67, all of Gaza and all of the West Bank, all of the West Bank was under Jordanian rule, all of Gaza was under Egyptian rule. Israel had nothing to do with it between those years. Still, Hamas has gone from the river to the sea, and by implication, I don't know what it means. It means there's no Jews in there, and it means genocide of some kind. Now, 67, Israel got Gaza as part of the 6 Days War and left in 2005. In 2005, they said, we're out of here. We cannot govern you, we cannot manage you, that settlement, we're getting out. You were talking about checkpoints and settlers going in. There's no settlers in Gaza. They haven't been since 2005. Gaza has been left. Israel went out, except Israel supplied them with fuel and water and everything for free, but that's beside the point. Now, Hamas is not interested in a Palestinian state. They're interested in the destruction of Israel, two different things. And as far as genocide, Rob was, I think, totally correct when he said the numbers are the numbers, and you got to separate between casualties and combatants. We don't know, because all the numbers you have in Gaza are just one pool of numbers supplied by Hamas. Nobody counted, nobody knows, and so on. What is the ratio between combatants and civilians? We don't know. Nobody knows. So that's one thing. Now, just going to your definition of the 5 points of genocide.
It's not my definition, that's the
Right, the
legal
UN, the
definition.
UN definition. I'm sorry, the definition that you provided, but that's the UN definition of
It's
genocide.
the genocide convention definition, that's international law.
Right, I agree. I mean, it's a perfect definition. But everything on that definition applies to what Hamas did on October 7th. You said it's a violation of international law. No, it's those 5 points, except the 5th point, the E, is not something that Israel did, only Hamas kidnapped babies. Kidnapped babies and took them to Gaza. They just returned their dead bodies the other day. So, you know, it's not like on October 7th, Israel woke up and decided to launch a genocidal attack on Gaza. That's
Thank you. David, please.
Very briefly, it's not like the problem started on October 7th either. You know, now, look, should there have been reparations for what happened, you know, for the Holocaust, for Jews, not just for Jews, by the way, but for many other people as well? Yeah, absolutely. That reparation does not mean taking over land other people are living in. That is the root of that problem. And it's not easy to figure out a resolution, but let's be clear. Just because there were survivors like Holocaust doesn't mean they did not drive Palestinians from their villages. And you know, that is inevitably what is going to happen. Now, did Hamas, you know, I'm not arguing about Hamas. I'm not defending Hamas. But I'm talking about what Israel has done, not just after October 7th, but over the years.
Rob, would you like to
I just want to say one thing too. It's just you know, we want to take the long view of this. You know, Jews have been living in Israel for what 3,000 years roughly, and you know, he talks about taking land that other people are living in. Well, Jews have been living in that area continuously for the whole time, you know, everybody knows I think the biblical story of David and Goliath, right? David, the shepherd boy, and Goliath, this huge bruiser. Who was Goliath the champion of? He was a champion of the Philistines, who were a rival group that the Hebrews were at war with. Well, I found that, to my delight as a student of classics, I found out that the word Philistine is the actual historical root of the word Palestine. So this is this division of, and actually the Philistines were based in Gaza, in that same, that city has roots going back thousands of years. They weren't Arabs, they certainly weren't Muslims back 3,000 years ago. They were more Greek and Phoenician. But there's these divisions are things that go back 3,000 years. So this isn't some claim that was imposed in 1948, right? By Jews fleeing the Holocaust. This is a 3,000-year-old conflict over land, and we are trying to. The question has to be, how do you find a way to finally put this conflict into some sort of stable end state where each side will accept the other? And I think, unfortunately, that you can't do that with a fanatical Islamist regime in power in Gaza. And so any solution that doesn't find a way to end that is just going to lead to another 3,000 years of conflict.
Other questions, particularly from students? Yes, please.
For Krasinski. I understand this is a difficult question, and I'm not expecting a comprehensive answer, but how would you better define genocide to not include all examples of war?
Mm-hmm. I think you'd have to have not just a clear and broad intent and a more sweeping attempt to carry it out to actually kill a large percentage of the population. Now, one of the things that this fellow mentioned here was that prior to October 7th, especially after the disengagement from Gaza, they sort of walled off Gaza and said we're not going to go. We're going to separate ourselves from there. Israel was still providing electricity. They were still providing fuel. They were still providing water, I think, to the people of Gaza. This is not what you do if your intent is to wipe a population out. So what you do when provoked by an attack, that indicates that it's the attack that is the reason why you're doing it. Now, I agree with David on one thing, is that if you go through and you look at, there are factions in Israel. Some of the, I said that the Hamas are religious fanatics. There are religious fanatics in Israel as well who are, God gave us this land and we're going to drive everybody else out. So you can find, fanatical factions with a genocidal intent in Israel. But Israel is also a large country, has a whole parliamentary system with different parties involved. A lot of the policies we're talking about are ones that are, that have been done in coalition politics with parties of the left being involved. So, this is not something that you can cite that there is a faction within Israel that's genocidal intent, but that applying that to Israel as a country, Israel as a whole, I think will not hold up, and it certainly is contradicted by many things Israel has done. If they wanted to, basically, they could inflict. Israel has the power to inflict a lot more civilian casualties, and has had the power over decades to inflict a much higher level degree of suffering and death in Gaza. And their actions have been, things like keep the electricity flowing, keep the water going, often for free, which is not consistent with a genocidal intent.
David, you want to respond?
A couple things. One, there is a concept in international law of proportionality, and the basic question is the civilian death toll proportional to the aim for which you have? And here in Gaza, it was totally disproportionate. Except for the fact that Israeli leadership says they're all terrorists.
Are you claiming?
Let me finish. No, let me finish.
Okay. Let him finish, please.
Okay. I think if you read the Special Rapporteur's report, it goes into that. It discusses those things. It discusses the fact that Israel has claimed to allow water in, but to a large extent cut it off. That many of Israel's claims are a distortion of what international law requires. And quite frankly, not when Gaza is a member of Hamas, just like not everyone in Israel is a member of the government, but this government absolutely has that intent.
Professor Garari, you had a question?
Just, what would a proportionate response to October 7th would have been like? Burning people, killing babies, destroying homes? That would have been proportionate. Because that's what Hamas did on October 7th.
That's a distortion of what.
That's distortion?
Proportionality, I think we're going to agree with this one, that proportionality as a principle means proportionate to your aim. The number of casualties is proportionate to the military goal that you have, aim that you have, rather than being, the even swap. They kill 5,000 of our people, we get to kill 1,000 of theirs. That's not what proportionality means. But it also means that, if they kill 1,000 of our people, we kill 10,000 of theirs. That's not necessarily against proportionality. It depends on its proportionality relative to the military aim.
Yes, please.
So back to October 7th. So October 7th happens, people are raped, kidnapped, and so on. The Israeli government is under pressure to respond somehow. You mentioned that the response is, not the right response, but there's demand to get hostages back, which is one of the aims. We could see that some hostages are still not back even after such a response from Israel. But what would their response be to get these people back that were kidnapped? I don't know. Do you think they could have responded in a different way, and if so, how, to get those hostages back?
I mean, it's not an easy question necessarily.
Yeah, I know.
But just the families of the hostages certainly were the most vocal in opposing the response that took place. So at least the families of the hostages saw some different way. And maybe a little bit of thought before the response would have helped. The response was immediate. I remember, and students may not have been alive back in September 11th, but kind of 2 days after that happened, we had this USA Patriot Act. It wasn't like people just put this thing together and came up with an acronym in 2 days. They were waiting for some reason to do it. And, you get the feeling with Israel, they was just waiting for some reason to do it.
You want to respond to that?
Well, so one thing is the reason why there's an immediate response is every nation, especially every nation with a professional military, has contingency plans, right? I'm very much hoping there's no contingency plan on the shelf for invading Canada, but we have, because I don't know why we would have created that. I really hope we're not working on it right now. But you'll find probably a contingency plan on the shelf in the Pentagon somewhere for invading Iran, or for invading any other country where we might potentially have a beef with. Essentially, any country where we find ourselves, we need to do something here. There's a planner at the Pentagon who's worked out, here's how you go about doing it. So I'm sure they had a variety of different contingency plans for different operations, and that's why you see the immediate response. And there's probably also some stuff with the Patriot Act, and I agree with you in not liking everything in the Patriot Act. But there were people who were pushing for different responses to the threat of terrorism prior to 9/11. And of course, the immediate panic, it's an opportunity to get your position pushed through. But the elusive question here is, what could Israel have done differently? And I want to have people have to take into account, Hamas had spent years, decades, enormous amounts of resources they weren't putting on improving the lives of the people living there. Enormous resources they put into a vast network of tunnels buried underneath that were supposed to be specifically resistance to Israeli attack. And this was the plan: is we go across the border, we attack Israel, we come back, hide in the tunnels, and they won't be able to root us out. And so then we'll be able to then do that same attack again in the future. Wait again and do the same kind of attack in the future. And that's so the Israeli objective is to get rid of the tunnel network, to get rid of the military infrastructure of Hamas, which I don't think they're going to 100% do. They have now a ceasefire. But one of the things I also want you to notice is there's a reason why we have a ceasefire now suddenly, and you're getting negotiations to get the hostages back. And I think it happened only after the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah. They had, which is actually a nicely targeted attack. This one where they put explosives in the pagers and the phones that the Hezbollah organization. These were things distributed specifically to Hezbollah fighters and their organizations. It's a great example of a targeted attack, right? Somebody who has one of these pagers is somebody who got this because he's part of the Hezbollah organization. He's a soldier. And so that was one with a very low rate of civilians, actually the much larger number of Hezbollah fighters that killed relative to civilians. And it's only after the threat of Hamas attacking from the north was over that Israel was like, okay, now we're ready to make a deal, because it was driven by the requirements of their security.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I've got 12:50. I apologize, Professor Nazaretti. I would love to have gotten your hand. Please join me in thanking our speakers for today. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you very much. David, Rob. Groups that's students at the end and up the ranks. Sorry, can you get your on? It's okay. Sorry, I was a bit late. I had to, guys, how are you? I'm ready and my colleagues. Hey, how you doing?
You've been a part of all this, so that, Thanks. Thank you guys for putting on the debate, the parameters, and get a better perspective, and this is
Robert Krasinski. That's other folks who think you go with yourself, but it's other folks.
fantastic. Thank you, David, Rob. I know we got a full lineup here. Thank you, gentlemen. Extremely well done.
I really appreciate it. Thanks.
I'm gonna run in this car, so.
I gotta go and get into my traveling clothes.
Right,
Should I take you to the hotel and then?
No, I got myself here. I just
okay.
got to the restroom. Good, how are you?
I shall be back in 10 minutes. The car is in plant, so I have to go.
So you'll be back here in a second?
Right, 10:15.
Okay, just figuring out.
Okay, I'll show you. Okay, I'll come pick you up.
I just want to say thank you for the debate as well. Hi, Jana. And I more so I definitely agree with your side. Like, the question is not, is Israel justified in genocide?
What were you doing that was more important than this debate, man?
I think you made a really good
Is there a class here?
You guys got time.
What else could they do?
I will.
What do you got time now, bro? You got a few minutes, Nathan, you're all right. Well, Carr's not gonna be here for another 10 or 15, so I have an office to do. That's good to see you. Good to see you.
Good luck in your health. When's that?
Thank you. Okay. Tuesday, Thursday? Yep.
Can I make a quick suggestion for a follow-up? Sure. So the thought that was coming to me a lot was we should email students, especially those that attend, like where they can find good information on this, right? Like, 'cause I find it's really hard to parse out biased reporting on both sides of the situation, you know?
Because that line, everyone has a perspective. And, you have to understand what their perspective is to be able to evaluate what they're saying.
I'm not sure I have a good answer for you on what a good source of information is.
Because a lot of it, you can start to go down conspiracies on both sides and like. Yeah, I was recently,
I would say go to the ICJ.
I'm sure. I was recently in Armenia, and my friend there works directly for the prime minister, said there was Israeli generals on the ground in Azerbaijan, essentially coaching them on the displacement of people out of this contested region. And it just seemed really interesting, the timing and all of that stuff, And it's just, when you go to look these things up, you can't find any information on this.
I wish you would have raised your hand earlier so we could talk about it. That's really
The
interesting.
question, if you can't find the information, that itself could be a conspiracy.
Well, this is coming from the right-hand man to a prime minister, but.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it's not a conspiracy.
Let's exit.
Men's room. Yeah.
We break down what games? Games time, tell what we got?
Yeah.
Exciting? What game you guys playing today?
Classified last time what God was going against, like, issues, and, yeah, let's say we have thrown an interview style,
Yeah. I don't know what the field research looks like on that.
Well, because you count, I get that on the end, and then honestly, that could just be left the way it is right now. Because isn't it, well, like, how do you show it? Just the jewels, yeah, yeah, they're like, yeah, just fitting. Yeah.